Let's have a little thought experiment. So if you can imagine it, I'd like you to picture Matt Powell lying his ass off. What is up, you heathens and demons, you sinners and saints, you beautiful, blasphemous bastards? Welcome back to The Raging Atheist. I am your boy Nakasuchi, and today we're going to be taking a look at Matt Powell, who is once again perpetuating atrocious lies about one of the greatest massacres in American history. The Columbine school shooting, especially for people who grew up in that era, who remember it fresh like it was yesterday, was a tragic event. And, the news media of America was really trying to learn how to deal with those kinds of events. It was a new phenomena that was taking part in the country. We had school shootings before, but this was a really ramped up phenomena, and Columbine would become the school shooting that would hit the national media attention, and the national media would make a lot of mistakes. They would report a lot of misinformation, especially in the first 48 hours, maybe a week. A lot of misinformation was reported, and a lot of misinformation about Columbine still gets perpetuated, and Matt Powell is going to do that today.
Hey guys, this is Matt Powell. In a few days from now, it'll be the 22nd anniversary of the Columbine shooting, where Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris went into Columbine High School. To date, it's still the largest high school shooting that ever took place in America.
That just isn't true. That is Matt Powell lying to you. Matt Powell, if you're trying to find stats, find the right ones. Columbine is not the biggest high school shooting still in America. The Stoneman Douglas shooting had 17 victims. Columbine only had 12. Columbine had 12 victims, 21 injuries. Stoneman Douglas had 17 victims and 17 injuries. Stoneman Douglas is the biggest high school shooting that we have had in America. Not to mention, one of the first ever school shootings ever, the University of Texas shooting, was bigger than that. The Sandy Hook Elementary shooting, elementary school kids, was bigger than that. And the biggest ever was the Virginia Tech shooting.
And it's probably the most famous school shooting, but what I find interesting is that there are certain things that the media doesn't cover. There's certain things that they don't talk about, and I just wanted to bring them to the forefront. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were both very atheistic.
That is just blatantly untrue. Eric Harris, Dylan Klebold never claimed to be atheists, never said that they were atheists. In fact, both grew up in Christian homes, both grew up with a Christian upbringing. Now, I'm not going to sit here and deny that they weren't in some kind of rebellious phase. Clearly they were. And clearly they did mock people that they knew who had, really extreme faith as they were shooting up the school. But there is no evidence whatsoever that indicates that Eric Harris or Dylan Klebold were atheists. Now, Matt is choosing his words carefully here. He's saying atheistic, pointing the finger at fellow Christians and saying, of course you're not Christian, because Christians would never do this, but they have throughout their history. Christians have a very violent history, and I'm sorry, Matt, but these two people grew up in Christian homes. As well, his claim about this being the most famous shooting. I think, how do you determine that? I will agree, Columbine, people know about it. It has seeped into the subculture of this country. But I think I would maintain that the Stoneman Douglas shooting might be the most famous, or even the Texas University shooting might be the most famous, as it was the first. But the Stoneman Douglas shooting, the victims of that shooting coming out and making a national sensation. Well, how do you determine the metrics of what's the most famous school shooting in America, Matt Powell?
And they firmly believed in evolution. And there is powerful evidence that evolution theory, their belief in survival of the fittest, is actually what caused them to act in such a way and to display such a terrible behavior.
This, again, is just blatantly untrue. There is no indication whatsoever that evolution played any role at all in the Columbine shooting. What did play a role was their fascination with Adolf Hitler and other things as well. But they both developed a fascination with Adolf Hitler, neo-Nazism, and Adolf Hitler's warped ideas of natural selection and how one race is superior than all the others. It had nothing at all to do with evolution, and a lot of it had to do with neo-Nazism, as well as suicidal tendencies and Eric Harris's want of infamy. And in fact, Dave Cullum, who spent years investigating this, talking to the survivors, combing through the shooter's diaries, he reports that the motive for this shooting was 1, infamy, and 2, suicide.
Before the shooting, Eric Harris actually started a website about evolution and promoted evolution on his website. And he said on there, he said, "You know what I love? Natural selection. It's the best thing that ever happened to the earth. Getting rid of all the stupid and weak organisms. But it's all natural. Yes."
You know, that might be a quote from one of his websites. That might be a quote from one of his diaries. But Eric Harris did not have a website devoted to evolution. We know what he had websites for. Eric Harris had websites for Joe Mama jokes, which Dylan Klebold and an unknown associate was involved with, and it was a silly page telling your mama jokes. He had a website dedicated to Doom the video game. I believe he had a website dedicated to just ranting about life, and he had 3 different websites dedicated to quote-unquote missions, which was basically him and Dylan Klebold experimenting with making pipe bombs. Now, I will have you notice that Matt Powell is in his car, and he did throw up a little quote there, but he's not showing you where he's getting any of this information. But I want to show you something. This is the person that posted the URLs of Eric Harris's websites and some of the things on those websites when he could before those websites were taken down. Now, the websites were taken down by the FBI after the shooting. Then the URLs were made public after those websites were actually taken down. So nobody actually has any of those websites and never have. I'm going to read now. It says here that Eric Harris had an active online presence. He participated in a number of pastimes via the internet, including Doom death matches and playing on a Quake team. He made websites where he posted about the games he played. He had more than one scream name he used on chat on AOL and WBS with. He distributed the levels, WADs, he made for the first-person shooter games he liked to play. He posted the lyrics of his favorite songs, and he wrote rage-filled rants about life, web postings that became the subject of much public scrutiny after April 20th, 1999. In the months that followed the shooting at Columbine High, the contents of his web pages were sealed by the FBI. It was difficult to locate this information afterward, as AOL and WBS removed the content once the FBI was done with it. I managed to save several files from his accounts before the directories were deleted, but the HTML webpage files from the AOL accounts were already gone by the time I was able to access them. I did find the pages from a couple of his WBS pages, which contained bad Joe Mama jokes and song lyrics. Though various sources I tracked down scans of the text versions of several of his AOL pages, but it's only the text the investigators printed out. What the actual websites looked like is gone for good. Back in 1999, I displayed the graphics I'd saved along with relevant links that I tracked down in a format I thought would give the reader a better sense of what they might have looked like when used on a web page. Unfortunately, these display pages were mistaken by some to be Eric's actual web pages. My display pages were copied and posted on other websites that claimed the pages and were copied of his actual site. To be clear, Eric's actual web pages were removed from the internet by the FBI before the URL addresses were released to the public. There are no copies of Eric Harris's actual websites out there. Any site claiming to have them is mistaken. And then it goes on to tell you the AOL directory is mirrored here, and in none of these is evolution ever mentioned. And in fact, in none of these is natural selection ever mentioned, though, as I said, Eric Harris did have warped ideas about natural selection, as did Dylan Klebold, based on their fascination with Adolf Hitler. Matt Powell is lying to you, bold-faced lying to you, when he tells you that Eric Harris had a webpage devoted to evolution.
That was his ideology in life. Now, him and Dylan were bullied in the school, but instead of turning to God, they turned to their religion of atheism, their religion of evolution, and they ended up killing and murdering tons of students and harming people and literally terrorizing people at the Columbine High School.
No, not because of their quote-unquote religion of atheism. No, not because of their quote-unquote religion of evolution. And I have to point out that plenty of Christians believe in evolution. Evolution has nothing at all to do with atheism. Nothing. But it wasn't because of that. And no, it wasn't because they were bullied. In fact, Dave Cullum, in his book, outlines how both of them had actual very active social lives. In fact, Dylan Klebold attended prom with his date 3 days before the shooting. We know the motives. We know that Dylan Klebold was suicidal for 2 years previous. We know that Eric Harris had a fascination with Adolf Hitler and infamy, that he wanted to be famous forever. We know that this was a murder/suicide. We know that this was a failed bombing, not a successful shooting. The shooters intended to kill everybody.
It's a very sad story. And in fact, Rachel Scott was the first person that they had shot. And after they shot her 4 times, they waited around for a few minutes while she was bleeding out, and they asked her, they said, "Do you still believe in God?" They picked her up by the head, by the hair, and they asked her, "Do you still believe in God?" And she said, "You know I do." And they shot her execution style. And so they went through the entire school asking people, "Do you believe in God? Do you believe in God?" And whenever the student would say yes, that was their death sentence. They would...
No, Matt Powell, you're lying again, or you've been deceived. Stop watching Christian movies for your quote-unquote facts, because that Christian movie just got it wrong. None of the investigators, or no reporting, no investigative reporting, none of the reports coming from the investigators on the scene gives that story. There is one eyewitness that was eating lunch with Rachel Scott that day when the shooters came up to her. They mocked her faith before they shot her. There was no picking up of her head, asking if she believed in God, and then blowing her brains out. They mocked her faith and then they shot her. They did ask the other person, "Do you believe in God?" He said no, and they did leave him alone. It's the only case of that in the entire thing. They had 99 homemade bombs. They had placed 2 very large bombs in the cafeteria, and all indications show that they were planning on blowing up the entire school. Those bombs did not go off, so they resorted to going around and terrorizing people for as long as they could. That included mockery, that included taunting, and they seem to have had a list. And Rachel Scott, who had a personal relationship with Eric Harris for the prior 6 months before the shooting, seems to be one of the first on that list.
And so they went through the entire school asking people, "Do you believe in God? Do you believe in God?" And whenever the student would say yes, that was their death sentence. They would blow them away.
Again, an absolute fabrication, an absolute lie. That did not happen. None of the investigators that investigated that shooting ever put that in any report, ever claimed that. No investigative reporter ever claimed that. Nobody has ever said that. There was a fucking Christian movie that said that because she was martyred, and this myth has grown up around her. And I'm not taking away from the tragedy of her death, not at all. But I am saying you using this to perpetuate your demonization of evolution and evolution theory is horrendous, Matt Powell.
And so whenever the student would say, "No, I don't believe in God," they would leave him alone.
Again, another lie. That happened one time according to one eyewitness, and you have to understand that any eyewitness in this situation, their testimony is unreliable. The body does a lot of crazy things in these kinds of situations. Your memory and what you see is unreliable. You have to piece together these massacres over time. And yes, the media fucked it all up by reporting this and that way too soon. And all of these things are still out there. They still exist. And Matt Powell, you clearly are falling for the bullshit.
And it was just a very sad thing that happened. I mean, they even shot Isaiah Shoals just because he was black. And they considered him to be inferior, and they made racial slurs against him. They did all this on Adolf Hitler's birthday. Adolf Hitler was an avid evolutionist.
And here we get to it. Here we get to like the real reasons, and Matt Powell knows them, and he's just blatantly lying to his audience to try to perpetuate a demonization of evolution. Because the underlying motivator here, as I said, was infamy, suicide, but also the worship of Adolf Hitler. Also, the acceptance of neo-Nazism. Also, the acceptance of this warped idea of natural selection and how the white race is Aryan and the white race is superior. And yes, of course, they put out a lot of derogatory racist things online. Of course, they ridiculed that kid before they killed him because they were neo-Nazis. This had nothing to do with evolution and everything to do with hatred. And for you, Matt Powell, to sit here and just blatantly lie about this is disgusting. And to see your comment sections and all the people that just accept your lies is disgusting. You utilizing this massacre, this tragedy, is disgusting. I wish your Christian brothers would call you out for it, but it does appear most Christians play team sports. And as always, if you like the video, if you like the content, hit that thumbs up, hit that bell so you're notified every time I put out a new video, every time I put out a new live stream. Comment in the comment section below. Let me know what you thought about my video, and let me know what you think about Matt Powell just blatantly lying about this tragic massacre. And as always, I'll see you soon.